Everybody, Chris Webster here to talk about one of the latest supporters to the Archaeology Podcast Network, The Motley Fool. Now, I've been investing in the stock market through various applications for a few years now, and everybody who's listening to this can benefit from that sort of investment for the long-term financial planning. And also, I know the hosts of these podcasts can benefit because as archaeologists, like none of us get retirement. We all have to kind of fend for ourselves. So investing in the stock market is a good idea, but not everybody can do it. And look, we get it. The market is complicated and confusing, and to many of us, it simply doesn't make sense. In fact, where do you even start? Take all of the guesswork out of it with the Motley Fool Stock Advisor. The Motley Fool has been around for over 25 years and has been spot on in recommending some of the world's most important companies before they hit the big time. I'm talking about Amazon, Tesla, Netflix, Starbucks, all before they exploded in value. With their easy to use and super informative service, Stock Advisor, you could join the ranks before they potentially find the next big thing. After all, their average stock recommendation is up over 400% as of April 10th, 2023. And no need to be intimidated by financial jargon or market complexities. As the name suggests, these guys don't take themselves too seriously. Now, finances, that's a different story. Their friendly and relaxed approach has helped over 700,000 people move closer to financial independence, all while beating the market and having fun. New members can access Stock Advisor for only $89 for their first year, a full $110 off the full list price. Don't sit on the sidelines and think about what could have happened. Visit fool.com/APN to start your investing journey today. That's $110 discount off of $199 per year list price. Membership will renew annually at the then current list price. So again, check the link in the show notes of this episode.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to Heritage Voices, episode 74. I'm Jessica Uquinto and I'm your host. And today we are talking about walking the ancestors home. Before we begin, I'd like to honor and acknowledge that the lands I'm recording on today are part of the Nooch, or Ute Peoples Treaty Lands, the Dinétah, and the ancestral Puebloan homeland. Today we have Dr. Michael Blakey on the show. Dr. Blakey is the National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Anthropology, Africana Studies, American Studies, and founding director of the Institute for Historical Biology at the College of William and Mary. He is on the Scholarly Advisory Committee for the U.S. National Museum of African American History and Culture of the Smithsonian Institution. He was scientific director of New York City's Colonial African Burial Ground Archaeological Site, which is now a national monument. He is co-chair with Deborah Thomas of UPenn of the American Anthropological Association's Commission for the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains. Welcome to the show, Dr. Blakey.
Hi, Jessica. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I'm so excited to have you here today. You came highly recommended by some very loved past guests of ours. And I wanted to get us started by talking about what initially got you interested in this type of work and the field of anthropology.
Well, you're asking a question about an entire life, actually. But I should say I was a science geek as a child in the 50s when science was all the rage. Both of my parents were scientists in their own ways, and that was certainly an influence. My father was a dentist who did dental research for endoosseous implants, which is the sort of plastic teeth that now people can screw into their gums, which then had not been invented. He was working towards that. And my mother, who was really an artist, had a degree in biology. So there was interest in science around our house in Washington, D.C. But my archaeological interest stems from a more personal experience, materially with my great uncle, my mother's uncle, Kermit Mosley in Delaware, just 2 hours away from where I was raised in D.C. My mother's people were Nanticoke Moor. They mixed Native American, African, and European ethnic group of their own. I wrote something about their history in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology in 1988. As a child interested in science, I imagined I was interested in my own heritage, that side of it. My father was wholly African American. That I was doing on weekends, we often visited Delaware. I would walk the cornfields or the soybean fields with my uncle, who was a real collector. He was one of the biggest collectors in Delaware. And find potsherds and projectile points and all kinds of interesting artifacts. And it's an opportunity to be contemplative about the past. Even my grandparents would occasionally go out in the field and do this kind of collecting. I lived for the science fairs as this kind of geek. So all year in junior high school, I'd prepare a science fair project. One of my two major interests was archaeology, and so I would parade not only the artifacts that I had found. Sometimes some of Uncle Kermit's would get on into my project, but would go home and study them and read all the archaeology that was available to me about that region. And I was also interested in marine paleontology. About halfway between Washington and Delaware are Calvert Cliffs on the Chesapeake Bay, where there's excellent Miocene. Was then good fossil hunting. I think much of it's Park Service now, and you can't touch it. But with a friend I was competitive with at the time at the science fairs, Bob Sikora, also had projects on those fossil beds. We would go out and collect together. He helped me get to these fossil beds. And my last year in junior high or middle school, I won the grand prize, I think it was for earth sciences in archaeology. Well, I should mention that I was doing well enough that I had a science teacher in junior high school who recommended me to Dorothy Martinek, who was a member of the Archaeological Society of Maryland. So at 13, she used to take me to the monthly meetings in Bethesda. And then as I getting to this year, after graduating from junior high school, see, I told you this is a lifelong thing.
Yeah, you're not kidding.
My father contacted, well, the real story is a little more interesting because I also love music and I needed to buy a guitar amplifier. This was like 1968. Imagine that. And so I needed a job for the summer. My father arranged with Don Ortner, who at the Smithsonian, who is one of the leading paleopathologists, for me to conduct a study in paleopathology. I looked at the musculature, muscle attachments, and dental pathology in a total of 50 skulls, and for the summer, and wrote a report that's consistent with what paleopathologists did then. So I was 15. And I also was a student of J. Lawrence Angel and Lucille St. Hoyme. They had a summer seminar there in paleopathology. And so I was the youngest and only Black member of those, student in that while I did my research. When I finished, I got the guitar amp and realized physical anthropology is very tedious. And I felt more creative than that. So I got into music, thought I'd become a musician in high school. And then at the same time, that's so common, play the guitar. But also, this was 1968 to 1971. Those are my years of high school in Washington. Long story short, I learned about politics. I learned about, I was compelled by the liberation politics of the time, the Black consciousness movement, Black power. I was in study groups with the Black Panther Party where I read Du Bois, Mao, Fanon, and others. Also in cultural nationalist study groups or organizations. I was all over the place. I didn't like to be tied down to any one tendency. except the tendency towards finding the truth, maybe, and finding the most progressive positions I could take. And so I was president of the Black Student Union at my high school, Coolidge High School in Northwest D.C. And we had Black Studies there for at least a year. I took 2 semesters of Kiswahili in high school. I was a Howard University student who taught it. As soon as my class, 3 years after my class left, apparently they closed all of that. And now we're still fighting just today, right? And the Florida Standard, DeSantis, and these sort of mad, resentful expressions of white fragility come to impede our ability to know ourselves. I don't think it will win, but it's a mess. So here we are. What is that? I can't even count it. 50 years later, trying to get a reasonable history into the high school classroom. Well, we had it for a little while when I benefited from that, which we demanded in the late 60s. Ultimately, I wasn't as good a musician as I had hoped. I did go to music school at Howard for a while. Things changed. I would just say maybe I have to mention that my family expatriated to Jamaica in 1971. The civil rights movement had achieved a lot, but not enough. They decided they would go work in a country that, under the Manley regime, a socialist Black nation. But I was also tied to these other interests. I was 18. I couldn't stay permanently as my brothers did. So I came back. I went to music school at Howard, where my father had previously taught. Then decided, no, this is not really for me. And returned to, fortunately, I had another love to which to return, and that was anthropology. Took courses there in the early to late 70s, actually, on and off, really 75 to 78. When, for the first and only time, there was a sizable Black faculty that was ultimately pushed out by sociology and what I call I'd say there's the best of Howard and the worst of Howard. And the worst of Howard is its mediocrity, which pulled out that removed that brilliant possibility of the first and only African-American anthropology program that could, as the title of the journal of the Association of Black Anthropologists reads, transforming anthropology, right? That could transform anthropology. But anthropology is much weighed down, I think, in Black institutions by its service to the enemy throughout much of its history. And so it's a complicated thing. But what wasn't was that I had happened to be there with these really interesting, often African-American anthropologists seeking to transform it at a particularly transformative time in this moment after the winds of the civil rights movement and before the 80s, when the backlash came to impede those developments. I finished at UMass Amherst, graduate program. I spent time at Oxford and University of London, while at UMass, and ended up teaching at Howard and other places. But what I have done throughout, I believe, is to create syntheses of anthropological specializations that equip me for what it is that I am interested in doing. Maybe it's special about anthropology. I don't know other fields as well, but it's broad enough that, I've studied archaeology at first, and I didn't mention this while in my junior year at Howard. I took Mesoamerican archaeology from Laura Henley at Howard, a Black student who graduated from Michigan in the heyday of the new archaeology. I studied at Dumbarton Oaks with an interest in doing Maya archaeology. I had an opportunity working with with the help of David Friedel at Cerro Maya in Belize to do a survey for a month of a site on the periphery that I mapped by myself with lots of quasi Indiana Jones excitement with snakes and bugs and jaguars, and came back to continue to develop my interest. I realized, because I was using Norman Hammond's spatial models at that time when I was a junior in my report, that I could take interpretations that were contradictory and use on a similarly substantial basis, which interested me. That the truth, that archaeology, as I initially saw it, was not sufficiently objective. I also studied, by the way, Great Zimbabwe and the political influences on its archaeology. At any rate, in my naivete, I decided when I went to graduate school, I would shift to physical anthropology, biological anthropology, for a more objective basis, real science. And what I made the choice that if I was going to get into this thing, that I would study its history. And so went back to the Smithsonian as a graduate student one summer and studied the Hrdlicka papers at the National Anthropological Archives. Hrdlicka was the eugenicist founder of American physical anthropology. I know his work now better than any other American, I'm sure. Frank Spencer, who was the only other person who knew as much, he wrote a long dissertation on Hrdlicka and missed some important beats, but, captured some things I didn't know. He and I were equivalent. He's no longer alive. So here I am, the expert on this man and the field he started. And what I learned was, I think part of the title of my article called Skull Doctors is intrinsic subjectivity, craniometry, all of that nonsense, suited white supremacy. And the people who read it and used it and conducted it were white. And I've increasingly looked at how people, Frederick Douglass initially debates with it in 1854 with Samuel Morton before Hrdlicka, and devastates it, these biodeterministic arguments. So those debates between Africana scholars and the so-called mainstream in physical anthropology, were increasingly interesting to me. And then in terms of synthesis, UMass, with the work of George Armelagos, Alan Swedlin, R. Brooke Thomas, were exploring biocultural anthropology, which I also learned on my own in that environment. So I was influenced by them and yet by other things. And I found out that these other influences were old African diasporic intellectuals' insights, that the causal arrow which the eugenicists and other mainstream anthropologists, the causal arrow they pointed from biology, whether it's race or now DNA, to behavior is misguided. And what we needed to do was turn the causal arrow on its head and have it point from society, from political economy, the structures of power and economic distribution, to human biology, that it is these things, that these aspects of our history, the one that we create ourselves as human beings, that determine differences in health and physiological effects, that important differences in human biology are created by human beings. And so UMass was working towards biocultural anthropology. Those with whom I had studied continue to develop it. There are a couple of nice volumes on this now. And I proceeded to, develop my version of it. Ran into Leslie Rankin Hill, another UMass graduate in Washington. And Leslie invited me in again to work with Larry Angel on the first African Baptist Church, the largest at that time African American skeletal population. I had done a lot of work with skeletal populations and living populations before. And so I found myself increasingly focused on, and she also is a biocultural anthropologist. And so we worked towards those goals, about theoretical goals, as well as of biocultural studies, as well as to elevate our knowledge of African American history where it was not adequately written about. As a student of mine once said, a poet student once said, so we read the body as text. Mm. And so I continued to work with those, including the African Burial Ground, who were interested in reading the body as text, but with the particular addition of which in our work is to ask permission and to do it in an ethical way. Just one thing that I didn't say, I meant to say in that part of the anthropological trip at UMass, I mentioned Armelagos and Swedland and Thomas. But as someone serious about biocultural studies, I felt it would be important to have as co-chair of my committee a cultural anthropologist. And here the leftist, feminist, African-American cultural anthropologist with expertise on the African diaspora, Jonetta B. Cole, became my co-chair of my doctoral committee. And she continues to have important influences on my thinking.
Well, that is a pretty amazing journey so far. And if you want to keep listening to Dr. Blakey's journey in anthropology, stay tuned right after the break.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts. O'Reilly
Auto Parts. Okay, so we're back from the break, and we're just going to dive right back into Dr. Blakey's journey.
So I guess that brings us up to the African Burial Ground. And I'll just say that since then, developing in that project what is being called what we're calling the clientage model, that has us as anthropologists, bioarchaeologists, work for descendant communities whose permission we have asked for to study their ancestral remains. That option of working on remains, if the ethical conditions of informed consent have been met, that we've had conversations about what research might reveal and what their concerns are as descendant communities. That's, by the way, a term that I coined in the 90s.
Did you really?
Yes.
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
I could talk about that moment too, but and I'll just say I was looking for a handle, as it were, for the protesting African Americans and African descent leadership in New York who were concerned about the mistreatment of the skeletal remains at the African Burial Ground, who were, I think, equally concerned about the anthropologists who were there, were ill-prepared to study had not trained for studying African American remains, much less African remains. So we my Howard team stepped in to take it over with people who were adequately trained and had a history of, as I mentioned, the First African Baptist Church, a history of the study of African Americans, but also entered with new ethical sensibilities. I like to say that we entered with empathy for those protesting people, which neither the GSA, which was our business client, nor my colleagues there had or demonstrated. We didn't say it much then, though people in the community did. It was about racism. And so, but I was sitting in the lab working on our proposal. We had a research design of about 160 pages to replace my colleague's 13-page research design that was mostly about the trash that had been put on the burial ground, not the remains of the people who were buried there. So we created once I got control of it with John Milner Associates, a contract firm, we, under my direction, wrote a longer research design, and one that the descendant community, through numerous hearings in downtown New York and Harlem, to which they contributed questions, and so we worked with their questions. So I was sitting there on the last version of this, and I was looking for a handle for them. What is their relationship? And certainly interested in an empowered relationship to the site. They certainly asserted one as they protested and had prayer vigils around the site, hundreds of people. You really needed to see that in 1991, 92. So I looked to the National Historic Preservation Act, where, because there was no NAGPRA, that was as close to the legitimating document for the empowerment of anyone on that site as there was. And I don't remember, frankly, whether it was the term descendant community or something that sounded like that. I looked in some places, I saw descendant group. I had used descendant community before in publication in '89, as I had worked with the World Archaeological Congress and Native American Rights Fund to support what would later become NAGPRA, which was unusual for physical anthropologists, very unusual. But at any rate, I know I found some language in Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act, and that became descendant community in my mind. Maybe it was literally in the document that I used as a way of tying the community to those legal rights. They had a right to comment, as I remember. Well, GSA knew they had a right to comment. Only the community in its own efforts, its own protest, would assert that comment, had teeth, had substance, had consequence. But having the name helped, and immediately community groups started talking about them, referring to themselves as descendant community or the descendants and all of that. So, and we had very clear ideas about, that they were our client. I wrote something in an article with Cheryl LaRoche in Historical Archaeology in 1997, where we began that talks about what had been developed on the project under my leadership, and it included this reference to that community as our ethical client. So that's the other part that I crafted as a way of understanding and reinforcing the empowerment of the descendant community, that they are also our ethical client. They are our client, and that is to say, we work for them because given that they care about these remains, which is one of the qualities of descendant communities, one of the things that defines them, the fact that they care about these remains means that we can hurt them by how we treat those remains. And therefore, we have an ethical obligation, essentially, to informed consent, which means they can say no to any research. And if we want to do the research, so we're promoting the idea that of a kind of plural democratization of knowledge, that we take community questions, we use those that can be answered substantially with empirical evidence because we are researchers. If they don't want that, then they want religious practitioners to, as most people do, bury their dead. We answer those questions and others they accept, as we did on the African burial ground. In the end, our 2,500-page reports that are available online at the National Park Service monument site, I believe, constitutes the most sophisticated bioarchaeological reports that have yet been written. You can hold them up against any others. And they involve questions like the origins of African Americans seen through the lens of those 419 individuals who were analyzed at the African burial ground. The physical quality of life created during their enslavement. The transformation at different African societies to an African American society. And then there's the question that is, I think, particularly important for African Americans, although all of them are important. Resistance. What were the modes of resistance? So these 4 questions were at the center of our 2,500 pages, and I think better questions than I have seen elsewhere answered between the covers of the American Journal of now Biological Anthropology. So I have continued in 2018 with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, for example, to encourage the development of an empowered public engagement, of a public engagement with descendant communities who are empowered to shape the questions, not the answers, but to shape the questions of research is quite a lot. And to improve the kind of research we do and to foster ethical research. As with recent work at James Madison's Montpelier, to put descendants in the position of telling their own story. All that just evolved, It's just about, I think, trying to be thoughtful about the encounters of my life and to use, once I wrote something about how one should choose a research topic, and I said something to the effect of, it should be something you're interested in and that you're good at. And thirdly, that appears to be of some value to people beyond, other than yourself. So those are often principles that I think about and that allow me to do the kind of work I do.
Okay, so much more to talk about after the break, but we do need to take a break right now, and then we will be right back.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
All right, so we are back from our break. And okay, so we talked about your work from, being a very small child getting into this field and how you were influenced by your uncle and really interesting your parents. You ended up doing a combination of everybody there with your work. I'm curious to hear more, looking back at this career, what are you currently excited about and what are you currently working on?
Well, I'm happy that I was made co-chair of the American Anthropological Association's Commission for the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains by the Executive Board with Deborah Thomas. We have brought together a stellar group of anthropologists. I think they're mostly physical anthropologists, but significant representation of archaeology and cultural anthropology and anatomy. One of the things they have in common is an ethical sensibility and a history of working towards better ethics for, and here's our charge, for the study of cemeteries, collections of skeletal remains, tissue samples, and DNA samples. So that's just about everything involving the human body that might be studied or that has been studied by anthropologists, anatomists, archaeologists. Our charge, as I see it, is to propose new best practices and ethical standards, which I believe will be what we'll ask for, are elevated ethical standards for all those fields: archaeology, biological anthropology, museology, and others, genetics, that handle human remains. I believe the inspiration for the AAA's creation of this commission was the fiasco involving our colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania and Princeton, where the remains of one or two children killed in the MOVE bombing, the mob bombing of that group's home, an African-American social and political organization's home in Philadelphia in 1985. It's a long and difficult story. But the remains of those who were burned included two children, skeletons, and has been really quite well confirmed that at least one of them was kept. It should not have been kept by anthropologists at Penn. It should have been returned to the parents, or at least the medical examiner, but was instead kept in the private hands of our colleagues, and then later brought out as a part of a online forensics course and displayed. It took this incident to jar our colleagues sufficiently to realize that they had been objectifying human beings in ways that were unethical. In fact, Janet Monge, who was the teacher in this case, was not found by a legal team to have been unethical. That could be debated because it did hurt people for the child's remains to have been displayed, even where her relatives might have seen it, and who thought that she had been reburied, by the way. But I think part of the reason why it was not seen as unethical, if very poor judgment, which is what they did come to, is not that far from what my colleagues generally do. And in fact, I'll just say, when we began our use, essentially, of informed consent in New York on the African burial ground, to follow descendant questions, to accept and assume that they would be in charge of the final disposition of their remains, where they allowed us to do research and then reburied and created a monument. White anthropologists were saying it was reverse racism. Throughout the 90s, And this kind of nonsense has continued. So there are some who read our work and use it, others who quite petulantly continue to insist that, oh, that was just reverse racism. Black people were saying only black people could study black people. It was never I never said that in the press. This was white fragility. So what I'm saying is that anthropology is largely white, and physical anthropology is very white. And they, historically, from Hrdlicka or Wharton onward, there has been the objectification of the other. And that also embodies a certain kind of power relationship in which my colleagues have used the other. And so accumulated collections at the Smithsonian and elsewhere, where Native Americans were able by 1990 to gain control, and African Americans are still struggling, and now are in a position, I think, by virtue of this most recent embarrassment, hopefully we'll be able to see ethical treatment of everyone's human remains. And so that's what the Commission for the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains is charged to do, to lay out new ethics for everyone's remains. And in that effort, we've obtained the support of the Wintergren Foundation to have global listening sessions. And so we will be talking with, as a commission of 9 people, talking with, or some representatives of us, will be talking with our Japanese colleagues and Ainu and other indigenous Japanese representatives who are concerned about the treatment of human remains by our colleagues there in Japan. We'll visit Australia at Queensland, meet with Australian Aboriginal representatives and our colleagues there with a listening session with each, and then with both, about the treatment of human remains, to understand what the concerns are and limitations and openness is. And then we have already finished. Rachel Watkins with Deborah Thomas just finished a listening session in Cape Town at the University of the Western Cape, and we had one at the American Anthropological Association meetings, just talking with our colleagues. And then in the end, in 2024, having listened, accumulating also all of the documents that we can find about ethics involving that might relate to human remains, we will come to our conclusions. I've found that good ethics, the sharing of of power, leads to better questions, leads to better science. That the ivory tower notion of how to conduct research is okay at times, but often not the best thing. Collective influences on research questions produces anthropology of broader interest. So in New York, though African Americans had often been involved in sort of trips to Egypt from New York or Chicago or DC, where they saw their archaeological heritage, domestic African American bioarchaeology had been of no interest to African Americans, though there were some, white people who liked sort of often the quite objectified way of understanding them through their bones. Sometimes better than that. But African Americans did not embrace it until it became their project, working for them with questions they were interested in. And I think they are much more interesting questions generally than what was produced without that. So I'm hoping that the democratization of knowledge will be a product of these new ethics, whatever they are, whatever we come to in a year from now.
Wow, that sounds like an amazing experience and project. It'll be really interesting to see the similarities between the four countries and maybe areas where they're different as well. And obviously, even just within the U.S., I mean, the difference, the diversity of experiences just within the indigenous communities, for example, are vast. So that'll be really interesting to see what conclusions you all reach. So one question that keeps coming to my mind that I'd like to ask you, as someone that supported the development of NAGPRA and then all the way through to the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act in December of 2022, which I should mention in my episode with Dr. Jackson and Delon Justinville, that it hadn't passed when we recorded it yet, and now it has, so that's exciting. But just from your experience in those years, those decades that passed in between, do you have any thoughts on why there was such a disparity and why it took, decades longer on the African American burial ground side than on the NAGPRA side?
Well, I think the issue of human remains stored in museums, excavated from ancient cemeteries without permission, was more a Native American problem than an African American problem. It was also a problem of settler states. When in 1990 I taught as a visiting professor at La Sapienza, my Roman colleague and I talked about this. He couldn't understand, well, what's the problem? He says, we excavate in the Vatican, which they do, or excavate in Abruzzi, where we were, and, community people come out. And I remember we had a great, celebration one night with food around a cemetery site. These were the descendants. We sang Volare. It was not contentious. Mm-hmm. But these were their ancestors. And the people involved in the excavation, were also Italian. And so my colleague Alfredo Coppa and I sort of agreed, this is a problem of settler states, where the ancient history is the history of the occupied, and the archaeologists are the occupiers, or their descendants, or their cousins. I don't know which. Maybe it's the occupied and the occupiers still. So in that, one can read the problem for Native Americans, Native Alaskans, and Native Hawaiians. I watched them organize. As a member of the World Archaeological Congress, worked with Larry Zimmerman at the first Intercongress in Vermilion and developed the Vermilion Accord with many Native Americans and some Native Australians and others. Clyde Snow, the great forensic anthropologist, human rights forensic anthropologist, was there as well. Leslie Rankin-Hill was there, but there were very few physical anthropologists who would show up at this meeting, which was meant to, I organized a session to build bridges between Native Americans and my profession. And the word came to us, partly from people at the Smithsonian and elsewhere, Chicago, that to talk with the Indians would be a professional kiss of death while we are running the session or organizing it and inviting people to come, anthropologists to participate. So I ignored them as I usually do, or took note and moved on forward. There was a point at which there was a debriefing by Jane Dykstra at the physical anthropology meeting. So they were meeting in '89 about efforts towards what would become NAGPRA. And they decided, they were reporting in this luncheon debriefing that, well, there are the political Indians and then there are the reasonable Indians. And we listened to the reasonable Indians who happened to be the ones who agreed with them. This reminded me absolutely of the late 60s. This was white people's nonsense. This was an attempt to justify their control by delegitimating the voice of the other as political. Yeah, you bet. As were their voices. And then I was on in '89 again. The commission for something like the disposition of human remains was the AAA's attempt to respond. And I thought that we had agreed, it was under June Helm, I'm trying to remember the archaeologist there. I thought we had agreed in the conversation that the policy recommendations would be for all people. But they had in the last minute, watched the last details of the language in the report, contained it to Native Americans, and even that was not as responsive to the empowerment of descendants as either the Vermilion Accord was or my thinking, where we had actually, talked ourselves into. Apparently they were not willing to go that far. So basically they contained it. And one of the reasons, therefore, that we are back to this issue of African Americans, or why the African burial ground needed to take those steps to establish it there in New York as the empowerment of descendants, is because the AAA, the white commissions, there were a couple of Native people on the commission, but I think it was, we were outwritten in the final document such that the recommendations were still limited to those that Native people had already demanded. So, of course, they're ahead. They got NAGPRA. There's still more work that needs to be done to shore NAGPRA up. Tribes need funding to help them implement NAGPRA. And African Americans who have a few thousand remains at the Smithsonian and other universities, including Howard University. That's a longer story. Created the Cobb collection to counter the racism in the other collections, using the other collections like the Smithsonian. Required, Audre Lorde calls them the master's tools, the legitimation of having its own collection in order to argue against, for Montague Cobb to argue against racism. But at any rate, here we are in the 21st century. Yes, African Americans have to catch up. We have another one at the Smith Center of the Smithsonian that'll happen in the spring, in which African Americans begin to assemble themselves as descendant communities towards the capacity of decision-making over their skeletal remains. NAGPRA is enhanced by the fact that tribal councils can decide through, informed consent, requires someone reasonably authorized to decide. Well, African Americans don't have such an organization or organizations for those purposes. Descendant communities are reasonably assembled at different times, as in New York, to take action. So they need to think about how they want to do that, and only they can decide that for themselves. So they're being brought together for many purposes, and hopefully one of which will be to develop some sort of polity that will allow ethics, repatriation, which Smithsonian is moving forward with. I saw something from Lonnie Bunch Secretary Bunch just a few days ago. Wasn't specific, but I think the writing is on the wall that repatriation of African American, anyone's human remains, will be possible at the Smithsonian in short order.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I could talk to you for hours and hours. I'm sure I have a million questions, but we are at the end of our time, sadly. But I hope that maybe, in 2024, when you and the commission reach your conclusions, maybe you guys will consider coming back and sharing all of those findings, because I think that would be really fascinating.
That sounds great, Jessica. Just plan to do that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for listening to the Heritage Voices podcast. You can find show notes at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/Heritage Voices. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or the Google Play Music Store. Also, please share with your friends or write us a review. Sharing and reviewing helps more people find the show and gets the perspectives of Heritage Voices' amazing guests out there into the world. Don't we just need more of that in anthropology and land management? If you have any more questions, comments, or show suggestions, please reach out to me at jessica@livingheritageanthropology.org. If you'd like to volunteer to be on the show as a guest or even a co-host, reach out to me as well, jessica@livingheritageanthropology.org. You can also follow more of what I'm doing on Facebook at Living Heritage Anthropology and the nonprofit Living Heritage Research Council, or on Twitter at Living Heritage A. As always, huge thank you to Lyle Belenkwa and Jason Nez for their collaboration on our incredible logo.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Oh, oh,